Hey everybody, Connor coming to you from the World Divide. Today is December 12th of 2022, and I'm going to give a brief update on the Russo-Ukraine War. There's currently not too much to talk about. There are a few areas where there are some somewhat active developments, most of them being around Bakhmut at the moment. So I'm just going to give a quick rundown. Same thing, starting from a hook, all the way from Belarus, the Kursk regions, Belgorod, Svatova front, moving down to Siversk, the Bakhmut front, which is certainly very key. Like I said before, the second battle of the war is taking place in Bakhmut right now, which means basically both armies are standing their ground until one side is defeated and has to step back. Starting up in Belarus, we continue to see buildups of troop formations, heavy equipment moving into the region. I certainly believe the Russians do have a plan for a northerly invasion of Ukraine. We'll see that culminate when the ground all over Ukraine is frozen, when they feel like they're ready. We move to the Belgorod-Kursk regions, artillery exchanges, nothing real more. Still more troop buildups in the Belgorod region north of Kharkiv. Moving further to the Svatova front. North of Kremenai, we're still seeing back and forth battles. The road that runs from Kremenai up to Svatova was temporarily cut. The Russians counterattacked, and now the Ukrainians and Russians are both in offensive stances in this area. Moving down to Bakhmut, the Russians have made some progress. Ever since the capture of Yakovlivka north of Soledar, the northern flank of Bakhmut has been under a lot more pressure, as well as there's an important gas station as a vantage point over northeastern Bakhmut that the Russians captured about a week and a half ago. And they've been using that gas station to launch attacks into the suburbs of Bakhmut in the northeast. And I think this is really important. They're attacking on 4 different directions inside Bakhmut. And this is the first time we could say officially that the Russians are now fighting in the residential areas of Bakhmut. And they're attacking from 4 different angles. They're attacking from 2 sides from the north. One from the gas station hooking down into the suburbs, one from a little bit further south, pushing along the street that runs through the industrial zone, where you have your furniture factory, cement factory, and this has changed hands multiple times. So we're seeing that. From Opitne in Ivanograd, the Russians are trying to surround a grouping in Opitna. There's a built-up fortification there that the Russians need to break before they can enter Bakhmut from the south. And now we're seeing reports that the Russians are pushing west from Kurdumovka, south of Bakhmut, towards a small village of Bilagora. Now, this advance has me curious because I've seen analysis reports of how the Russians are claiming that their main efforts are on Bakhmut, but I also feel at the same time there's another conglomeration further south outside of the city in the Donetsk region, Gorlivka, and this front hasn't moved at all. And I explained before in last videos, the reason for that is because there's these built-up large mounds on either side, which allows pretty much a vantage point of the entire area, built up, very difficult to work around these fortifications. It makes it nearly impossible for both sides to make any movements. So this part of the line hasn't seen any activity or very little activity as far as Russian advances since the beginning of the special military operation. But if the Russians are pushing towards Bilagora, and they're able to capture a few of the suburbs of Toretsk to the north, there's a few small villages north of Toretsk. In the current configuration, that would put that entire conglomeration in operational encirclement. So I think the Russians' focus is going to be on Bakhmut and the New York conglomeration. They're going to try to collapse both at the same time. But we'll see how this situation develops. We'll see what happens. Moving further south to the line outside of Donetsk City, Ukrainians continue to shell the city very heavily. 80 civilians died yesterday as a result of Ukrainian shelling. They are targeting civilians deliberately to force the Russians to show their hand and to force them to make stupid, unnecessary moves that are going to cost them casualties. But the Russians are pushing. The Ukrainians have attempted to make a few counteroffensive operations from Pervomaisk, basically weaving through. There's a bunch of reservoirs that run along. You have Pervomaisk here. You got Vadian, Opitna. The Russians have captured Opitna. Vadian, the Russians control the southern part. But this area is characterized by having a bunch of reservoirs run through it. And what the Ukrainians have been doing is they've been hooking for Pervomaisk and threading themselves in between these two reservoirs and trying to attack the Russians' flank to prevent them from taking Vadian. It was theorized at some point that they were able to push as far as the Donetsk Ring Road, which was an important fortification the Russians worked very hard to take. It turns out these claims were false. The Russians were able to repel all these attacks, but haven't seen any other updates from this region. Does appear to be activity, but the fog of war it's heavy at this time. Moving further south to Ugledar, no movements, just artillery exchanges, reco and combat, things like that. And then we move a little bit west to the fortification of Velika Novosilka. Now the Russians made an advancement in this area from the Vremivka tactical bridgehead. Vremivka is a suburb of Velika Novosilka. And this fortress is kind of characterized by having a bunch of rivers splitting the town into 4 pieces. And this tactical bridgehead, what it's meant to do is put pressure on this fortification and trap the Ukrainians there, cause such high attritional losses that the Ukrainians are forced to set back. So it's been a top goal for the Ukrainians to try to break this situation and to try to push the Russians back from this bridgehead. But the Russians recently just made an advancement. The Ukrainians stepped back from their primary line of defense without a shot. And the Russians actually, it's believed that, from what the Russians are claiming, that the Ukrainians were setting up a trap, and the Russians decided to step back without advancing any further. We move to the Kherson region. Still, artillery duels, nothing to note here. And that's it. Not really that many movements. We haven't really seen the culmination of the Russian offensive. I think the situation in Bakhmut should culminate in the next couple of weeks. It looks like the Ukrainians are being severely weakened there. A battalion group, a battalion a day in casualties is very severe. There's a large concentration of Ukrainian forces in that area. The reason I believe that the Ukrainians will step back from Bakhmut pretty soon is because they're starting to destroy bridge infrastructure, and you wouldn't self-inflict your own logistics if you didn't believe you could hold a piece of territory. And I think the Ukrainians are going to be forced to step back, but we'll see. I'll keep you guys updated. Thank you. See you on the flip side.